Sometimes, people are the scariest creatures of all. In today's episode, I've got some very unsettling stories featuring the kinds of people you want to stay far away from. People who don't have a concept of personal space. Enjoy these allegedly true and disturbing Let's Not Meet stories. If you have your own creepy experience, share it with us at darkstories.org. I might just narrate it. I'd especially love to hear some stories about mysterious creatures seen in Europe or scary abandoned places. Like and share this video to support what I do. And now, let's begin. Oh, and a quick note. These stories are not from the subreddit Let's Not Meet. They were submitted to my website, darkstories.org. Careful moving into new places. From Guzman. This happened to me while I was renting an apartment in Boston, as I was finishing my master's in the US. I'm not easily scared. In fact, I quite like it if a scary movie actually manages to frighten me. However, this series of events, which took place in the Boston apartment complex, terrifies me every time I recall them, especially when I'm alone at home, even though I left that place many years ago. So I was living in Massachusetts as a foreign exchange student from 2009 to 2012. The last few months of my living in Boston were chaotic, to say the least. I had some pretty bad financial problems due to an unfortunate issue with gaining access to my scholarship money. I was struggling to pay the rent on the previous place I'd been living in for a while. It was by all means a great place, close to the university and within walking distance of markets with clean streets and an overall pretty safe feel. But as life under grad school would have it, money soon became an issue, and I had to move out. Finding a new place was relatively straightforward because a friend of a friend was moving out of her own apartment around the same time. Her building was about an hour's bus ride away from where I studied, and in a not-so-nice part of town. Not ideal, but given my situation, I had little option. I spoke to the girl and the landlady by phone, and they both agreed to allow me to move in when the apartment was vacated, which only took a few days, as she seemed to be in quite a hurry. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back on it now, I should have been more keen to the fact that she also seemed very distressed just before leaving. And I mean more distressed than a person moving out should be. She seemed to be in such a hurry, in fact, that she even left a few of her belongings in the apartment. I called her and our mutual friend several times to try to arrange for her or someone to pick up her things, but to no avail. Apparently, she wanted nothing to do with that place anymore. Honestly, after what I experienced, I don't blame her. The new building was pretty big, about 10 stories high and pretty run down, with ugly stained mustard yellows and avocado greens adorning the long, dark hallways, with the occasional ominous flickering lights. The first few nights were uneventful, minus the annoying cockroach problems, which I was certainly not happy with, but I couldn't do much about it, other than reaching out to the landlady to request an exterminator, though she always seemed to put it off, as if to suggest cockroaches would be the least of my concerns. And how right she was. One night, while I was studying and listening to some music, I heard a strange knocking coming from somewhere in the apartment. After I noticed it, I turned the music down, trying to identify its cause and source. At first, I suspected the old piping or the vents, but upon listening further, I realized it sounded distinctly wooden, like someone lightly hitting and scraping a heavy blunt object on a wooden surface. I walked around, thinking it might be someone above or below me shifting furniture, or maybe a neighbor nailing something to an adjacent wall. But the sounds were almost rhythmic in nature, as if the person producing it were intentionally following a musical sequence, which incorporated scrapes, knocks, and dull thuds to create a melody. I walked out into the living room, and as soon as I did, the noises stopped, as if whatever was making them knew that I was close. This sent shivers down my spine, and I felt a sensation of imminent danger. The silence dragged on for a few seconds, though it seemed to last an eternity, until finally a single sharp knock came from the entrance door, making me jump and curse out loud in fear. I didn't move from where I was and just called out, voice slightly trembling. "Who is it?" There was no response. "Hello? Who is it? Please?" I tried to make my voice sound manlier and more burly, but there was still no response. I looked down at the space between the door and the floor, and noticed that the motion-sensitive lights were off even though there was definitely someone knocking at the door. I took a step forward, making the floorboards creak ever so slightly, and as soon as I did so, the motion sensor lights went off outside my door. I realized someone had indeed been standing motionless outside this entire time. I rushed over and peered into the peephole. Nothing but an empty hallway. I tried to notice any motion or listen out for anyone walking away, but nothing happened, and soon the lights turned off, leaving nothing but darkness. I made sure to check the locks and even shut the windows before going back to my room, confused and somewhat mad at the possibility that some idiot neighbor was pulling a prank on me at this time of night. As the days turned into a week, strange things continued to happen. Sometimes it was the darn knocking, and sometimes, I swear, I could hear shuffling noises coming from outside, and every time I looked, there was no one there. This was especially strange because when I asked an upstairs neighbor, Jin, who else lived near our apartment, she looked around nervously, as if trying to think of a lie first, before saying, "No one." Before I could continue and tell her about the noises at my door, she interrupted me. "There was a young woman who lived in the apartment right in front of yours until about 2 years ago." She proceeded to tell me that the woman was pretty and polite, though she mostly kept to herself. But things changed when she got involved with some pretty shady guys who would come around to her apartment and stay the entire night, blasting loud music and doing certain substances. Sometimes one of these men, who was maybe a boyfriend or an ex, would come around and the two would fight until things got violent. The police would have to be called. After a while, the man started to stand in front of her door for hours, just knocking and scratching at the wooden surface, with what some people speculated was a firearm. One afternoon, Jin told me the landlady knocked at the woman's apartment to collect the rent. After trying several times throughout the day, no one answered the door. The landlady spoke to the neighbors, including Jin, who lived in the apartment I was staying in at the time. They all said that they hadn't seen or heard of the woman or her stalker for days. The concerned landlady tried knocking some more, until finally opening her locked door with a spare key. According to Jin, the landlady walked inside and inspected the place, noticing the utter chaos of the young woman's apartment. With a disgusted look, Jin proceeded to report that there were piles of dirty dishes all over, cockroaches crawling freely and unafraid, dirty sheets draped over the closed windows, and even the rotting corpse of an emaciated cat under the woman's bed. But no sign of the woman who lived there. It was as if she just picked up and left everything behind, possibly to escape the stalker. However, the landlady eventually found the woman's key to the apartment on a counter, which as far as she was aware was the only other copy besides her own. Unless, perhaps, the young woman's stalker made other copies. Whatever the case, no one ever saw or heard from the young woman again, and whenever new people would move into or near the woman's previous apartment, they would hear strange knocking noises several nights in a row, Jin included. After the incident, Jin and several other people began hearing knocking sounds coming from their own doors, and whenever they would check, there would be nobody. I was frankly creeped out and very concerned. Could that psycho stalker still be looking for the poor woman and harassing other tenants? Whatever the case, it seemed Jin was all too familiar with my shocked expression, as if she had seen it several times before. She just shrugged and wished me luck. That night, I was on the phone with my boyfriend. I told him about my disconcerting conversation with Jin, and he, being much more superstitious than me, told me to be careful and to try to leave the place as soon as possible. Though, to be frank, I was amused at his theories and was much more concerned about the possibility of a living, breathing crazy person than ghosts. Just before turning in for the night, I heard the knocks again. This time, I was determined to see my harasser's face before threatening him with the police. I tiptoed as quietly as I could from the bathroom to the living room. I was in the dark and being careful so as to not step on any of the noisier floorboards. As I approached, I noticed from the gap between the door and the floor that the lights outside were off. Again, I heard scratches and knocking, making me extremely angry, though I held it in. Finally reaching the door, I looked into the peephole, my heart pounding so hard I could feel the pulses in my skull. Blackness, though. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I began to make out what appeared to be a large hooded figure, standing slightly off to the left of my line of sight. I could even hear heavy breathing, as if this person had been running a marathon. He was huge, judging from the visible shoulder. I was petrified, and my mind began to rush as the adrenaline kicked in. He was motionless. Finally, the large man moved fully to my line of sight, causing the motion sensors to trigger the lights, illuminating a horribly disfigured face. His left cheek was sunken inwards, showing a hideous scar running from his lower cheek up to his temple. His soulless eyes stared directly into mine. I fell backward, crashing onto the floor as I began calling out that I was armed and that I had called the police. Both of these were, of course, lies. I hurried back to my feet when I noticed that the doorknob was moving back and forth as I heard what sounded like someone attempting to unlock my door. Again, I made false threats, this time more out of desperation than anything, as I braced myself for either a fight or a daring escape. I eyed an open window, evaluating my chances of survival if I were to fall from the 5th floor. No good. As quickly as it had started, the motion at the door had stopped. I looked back, almost completely out of breath. Silence. The lights again turned off outside. I stood there waiting, gathering my senses to go back to my room and call the police. Before I could do so, I heard the single most dreadful sound I'd ever heard. The unmistakable sound of a firearm being cocked. I darted out of the living room, running into my bedroom and shutting the door as I ran toward my phone. I called 911 and told the operator someone was trying to break into my apartment. I stood at the corner, holding a lamp which I was ready to weaponize against my intruder. But nothing happened. A few minutes passed. The crushing anxiety was unbearable until, finally, I heard someone call, "Police!" Finally, I breathed a sigh of relief. I called out for help. I cautiously walked out of my bedroom, only to find the 2 officers already standing in my living room, the door wide open, unlocked. The police did a full sweep of the building and found nothing. I didn't sleep in my apartment that night, preferring to stay with a friend. I moved out the following afternoon, and from that day on, I always inquire about the history of any new place I move into, and about its previous tenants. A pair of creepy stalkers in Georgia, from Mary Jane 737. This happened in the 1990s. When I was in college, I had a job working at a jewelry store. I worked for this chain for about 2 years. The first store I worked at was located in a shopping center in a nearby town outside of Savannah. It was a small town that was kind of blue-collar, but our store did very well, and it always made money. Even though it was kind of out in the boonies, I liked working there because it was relaxed, down to earth, and the fact that the other employees were very good to me. That store also had great hours. We opened at 10 a.m. every morning and closed at 6 sharp every evening, and we were closed on Sundays. That wasn't too bad for a retail job. I was in my early 20s at the time and had just gotten out of a toxic relationship. I had my fair share of men of all ages who would approach me and ask me to go out on dates with them. But despite this, I was very shy, lacking self-confidence, and unfortunately for me, very few men who approached me fit the criteria of what I was looking for. The men that I considered to be the most desirable always seemed to be taken, so I would sometimes accept invitations to go out with men that I wasn't really attracted to. I thought that I would give them a chance to see if they had anything else to offer, beyond just physical attractiveness, maybe a good personality and integrity. I know this probably sounds incredibly shallow to many of you, but I was very young at the time, and I know a lot of young people think exactly the same way I did. There were 2 men who stood out from the rest, and this wasn't because of their physical attractiveness or sense of humor. It was because they were both creeps. One of these creeps looked like a rough country bumpkin. He wasn't attractive and he was kind of heavy-set. All the same, I tried to be nice and polite to people, and I remember talking to him on one occasion and noticing that he had kind of bad teeth and that his clothes looked a little worn and outdated. I would estimate his age to have been mid to late 30s at the time. He didn't ask me out, but he was a little too friendly. Nothing else out of the ordinary happened during that encounter, and I didn't think much of it until much later, when we would cross paths again in an unexpected way. When I was still employed at the jewelry store in the shopping center, I had a strange encounter with a man who would change the way that I viewed the world and who would shake my trust in people. This was definitely a wake-up call for me. I went to work one cool autumn day when my classes were over, just as I normally did. Not long after beginning my shift, a rather short, thin, and dark-haired man, who looked to be in his mid-30s, came into the store and began looking at some merchandise. Other than being clean-cut in appearance, there was nothing else that stood out about him. His features were nondescript. He wasn't especially handsome, but not ugly either. It was my job to greet customers and ask them if they needed any assistance, so I asked if he needed any help. He started talking to me about the merchandise, but our conversation quickly shifted towards me. He made the comment that he had noticed that I had started my shift late that day, and he asked me if I was taking college classes anywhere. I told him that I was. He began to tell me that he owned his own business and that he was always on the lookout for new employees to come and work for him. I asked him what kind of business he had, but he would not elaborate. He simply said that he was in the business of making something, and he then asked me if I might like to work for him. He started saying that I would make much more money working for him than I did in retail. He seemed to know that my job only paid minimum wage. I have to admit that I thought it was strange that he wouldn't tell me the name of his business, or what kind of business it was. But he had a good rap, and for a few minutes he sounded pretty convincing. At that time in my life, I was very young and naive, and I didn't know much about running a business. The man then asked me to meet him after work so that we could discuss this job opportunity that he had for me. I hesitated for a moment, and then he told me that I can meet him at a nearby Arby's fast food place. I thought about it for a few more seconds, and then I reluctantly agreed to meet him. He suggested that we meet at 6:30, though our store closed at 6. We employees still had to put away a good bit of the merchandise, including locking up the most valuable pieces in a safe, and we had to do a few other things before leaving. After he was gone, I kept having these nagging doubts about him. During the time that we talked to each other in the store, he never once gave me any indication that he was interested in me romantically. He seemed to be all business. but I still had this nagging thought that perhaps he really wanted more from me, and that this was just a setup. On the other hand, I also thought that he might be telling the truth, and that I might miss out on an opportunity if I didn't at least talk to him. I finally decided to drive over to Arby's to meet him. The women I worked with in the store were always very nice to me and somewhat protective, because most of them were older than I was. But on that particular day, none of them had paid any attention to this clean-cut looking man who I'd been talking to, so none of them knew my plans to meet him. I deliberately tarried around the store for as long as I could because I was just so unsure about what to do. I finally decided to go ahead and meet up with him. I figured we'd be meeting in a public place, so I'd be safe, right? So I drove out of the shopping center parking lot, heading over to Arby's, which was literally right next door. Because I had procrastinated for so long, I was late for our meeting. His car was leaving the parking lot just as mine was turning into it. I guess he was tired of waiting for me and had just decided to leave. But we did make eye contact with each other. This was undeniable because his eyes met mine. I thought he was serious about this job offer. I expected him to roll down the window and say something like, "Sorry, you're too late," or to point at his wristwatch and shake his head. But he didn't do any of those things. Instead, he quickly took off like a scared rabbit. I'll never forget the look he had on his face. He looked nervous and scared, as if he had been caught with his pants down. That told me everything I needed to know right there. He obviously didn't have good intentions, and this may have been a setup. I didn't know what exactly his plans were, but I felt as if I had dodged a bullet. I was also ashamed of myself for being so gullible and agreeing to meet up with him. I quickly forgot about this incident and continued on with my life. I didn't think I'd see him again. I figured that he had a wife and kids, and the last thing he wanted was for his wife to know that he had been planning to cheat on her with another woman. I thought that he wouldn't dare show his face around my place of employment as long as I was still working there. But I was wrong. About 6 months later, I was still working for the same chain, but I transferred to another location. I wasn't happy with its long hours and constantly being asked to stay late, or to work on my only day off. I was working at the mall location one Saturday afternoon when a small, thin, dark-haired man came into the store and immediately began chatting with me. Now I must point out the fact that I didn't immediately recognize the man as being the same man that I'd met at my previous place of employment. I hadn't given the man I met about 4 or 5 months earlier a second thought. So this man that approached me in the mall that day seemed friendly at first. He was fairly small in stature, about 5'6", about the same height as me. Really though, the only thing that stood out about him were his eyes. They had a glint of shininess to them. The man and I talked for several minutes. He mentioned that he had seen me working at the other location, the store in the shopping center, but I told him that I didn't remember him, which was true. I had a lot going on in my life with trying to balance work and college, and I had almost forgotten about the creepy guy who wanted to give me a job. He also said that one of my coworkers had told him that I transferred to the mall, so apparently he also knew my first name. I innocently continued speaking to him. At some point, he began to ask some questions, which seemed a little too personal, but I didn't think much of it. Not yet. He told me his name, first and last, then asked my last name, which I thought was kind of strange. But I told him. He also asked me what my age was and if I was single. Those questions are pretty typical, so I told him my age and that I didn't have a serious boyfriend. He then asked me if I might like to go out with him sometime in the future. I wasn't completely sure if I was interested or not. I had just met him, but I thought there was no harm in giving him my phone number. I thought, what's the worst that could happen? During the time that I was speaking to this man, I noticed that the store manager kept watching us, and that he had a very serious look on his face. I thought he was watching me because I was talking to Glenn too much and not working. Glenn finally left the store and I went back to work. I was taking some of the less expensive merchandise that was locked away below our cases and putting it out on display. As I was doing this, I noticed that a creepy-looking man was watching me through one of our display windows at the entrance of the store. I could only see his face, and not the rest of his body. I was wearing a short sheath dress that day which had a back vent, and I suddenly became aware of the fact that he was watching me as I was bending over. I had been previously warned on a couple of occasions by some other employees about bending over while wearing that dress. One older lady that I worked with told me that she could see everything whenever I bent over. I became embarrassed when I realized what was happening, but I tried to pretend that I didn't see the man watching me, and I stopped bending over at that point. The one thing that I remember most about the man at the window was the way that he looked at me. The only way that I can describe this look was that it was both lust and hatred, and it frightened me. A short time later, the store manager said that he wanted to speak to me. I walked over to where he was standing, thinking that I was in trouble for talking too much to a customer. But that wasn't it. My manager warned me. "I think you better be careful with that guy. He seems a little strange." He was referring to the man who had asked my number. "What do you mean?" I asked. My manager hesitated for a moment and then said that he had watched the man talk to me, and something about him gave off a bad vibe. But that wasn't the only thing. He said that once the man left the store, he noticed that he was looking at me through our display window at the store's entrance, and he was watching me each time that I bent over. Now, the manager was a handsome family man, and he'd always behaved very professionally towards me, so I never once thought he was hitting on me or flirting with me. He was in his early 30s at the time and had always been pleasant to work with. But he was now talking to me in a very serious and fatherly tone. He seemed to be genuinely concerned, and I knew he was not joking. He said that he was a man who looked at girls just like most other normal men do, but he said that he'd never looked at a girl the way he saw that man look at me. He said that it was creepy, and that he also noticed that the man's eyes were red and glassy, as if he had been drinking, or was under some sort of other influence. I thought to myself, he's right. His eyes did look weird. I knew there was something a little strange about them, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And I also hadn't realized that the same man that I'd been talking to in the store earlier was the same one watching me through the display window. I felt foolish for being too trusting, and for telling him my full name and even giving him my phone number. My manager told me to be careful about going to the parking lot after work, especially at night, and when he found out that I had parked further away than most of the other employees, he offered to drive me to my car. I accepted the ride, and he warned me again about being careful with that strange man. I had decided that my manager was right, and that I would just brush off the guy if he ever called me. I would just give him some excuse about not being able to go out with him. I thought that he would eventually get tired of being given the runaround and would give up. But I had no idea how determined the guy was. Now, because this happened many years ago, my memory is a little foggy about the exact sequence of events that transpired next. I believe that the next thing that happened was that Glenn attempted to call me a few times. And this happened back in the 1990s, and my roommate and I didn't have caller ID on our phone. Everyone had landlines back then. Our phone number was listed under my name, so he could have easily looked up my name and found my address that way. I believe I gave the guy some excuse that I couldn't talk the first time that he called. I distinctly remember him calling another time and my roommate answering. I had told her about him beforehand, and she already knew that I didn't want to talk to him, so she silently mouthed the words, "It's him," while on the phone. I shook my head, indicating that I did not want to speak to him, so she told him that I wasn't at home. He then called again, and I firmly told him myself that I was not interested in going out, not with him. I didn't know what else to say, but I was hoping that that would get rid of him. He didn't blow up on the phone, but I could tell by his voice that he was not happy, that he was a bit surprised, too. He asked why I had given him my phone number if I didn't want to go out with him. I told him that I'd made a mistake, hoping that he would understand and leave me alone. I didn't know what else to say at this point, but there was no way that I was going to go out with him. I said goodbye and hung up the phone, hoping that that would be the last time I'd ever hear from him. But it wasn't. My roommate and I didn't have a washer and dryer in the apartment, so we had to use a laundromat, even though I had a car. It wasn't unusual for me to walk instead of drive, and I often walked to the laundromat carrying my laundry in a basket. I didn't mind walking because parking was scarce in the downtown area where I lived, and I liked to get plenty of fresh air and exercise. So one day while I was leaving the laundromat, I saw a car that was stopped on a little side road, and I heard a man calling out to me in a friendly voice as if he knew me. I knew many people from college and from the place I worked, so I figured it must be someone that I'd met. I walked up to the window on the passenger side, and imagine my shock when I see that man sitting there in the driver's seat. I tried to be nice to him. We both said hi to each other, and then he asked me what I was doing. I told him that I was doing my laundry, and as I was talking to him, I looked at the interior of the car. It was off-putting. It was messy and had some old bags from fast food places. I also noticed that his car was older, and his eyes were once again glossy and red. He still had that same look in his eyes, that look of lust and hate. I think he saw that I had noticed that his car was both old and messy, and in some strange way, this hurt his feelings. It seemed as if he knew that I thought he was a loser. He then surprised me even more by boldly asking me if he could come over to my place. I was stunned by this question. Had he gotten the message the first time? Hadn't I made myself clear to him? I politely said no and that I was too busy, and I walked off. I purposely went back to the laundromat and waited several minutes, hoping he would leave. After I thought enough time had passed, I walked back home and didn't see him again for a while, thinking I'd finally gotten rid of him. One day when I was at the shopping mall, I stopped by the jewelry store. I didn't work there anymore and had recently quit. I just wanted to say hello to my former coworkers and wanted to tell my former boss that he had been right about the strange man. I filled him in on the details. As I was leaving the store, I glanced down the hallway, and who do you think I saw? The strange guy again. He was walking towards the jewelry store, and apparently he didn't see me at first because I saw that he was looking around, and he seemed to be muttering to himself. He looked mad, extremely mad. I was really and truly frightened by him now, and I started walking as fast as I could in the opposite direction, hoping he wouldn't see me. I wanted to get to my car as fast as I could. Unfortunately for me, he did see me. And I had parked my car in the same faraway parking spot as I used to park at. Something in my mind told me that he knew where I parked at too, and that if I went to it now, he would follow me, and there'd be some kind of confrontation in the parking lot. Besides, I didn't want to talk to him, and I was tired of making excuses. I just wanted him to leave me alone. I decided to duck inside a large department store. I was luckily well ahead of him. I went straight into the women's dressing rooms. I figured that would be the perfect place to hide. There was no way he'd find me there. I tried on several articles of clothing so that I wouldn't make the store employees suspicious of me, and when I thought that enough time had passed, I left the store. As I was walking to my car, I saw him standing on the sidewalk watching me. He didn't say anything, so I got into my car and drove away. I had recently broke up with an old boyfriend when I first met my stalker, so I was single and eager to meet someone new. I did end up meeting someone that I really liked shortly after that episode in the mall, and we started to date. We spent a lot of time at each other's apartments. Unfortunately, this new boyfriend only had about a year of college left, and then he would be graduating and moving back home. We did maintain a long-distance relationship for about a year after he moved, but we eventually broke up. Now, rollerblading was extremely popular back in the 90s, and my boyfriend and I each had a pair. One day we were rollerblading outside of the apartment. We were about 2 or 3 months into our relationship, and as I was skating, I noticed a car driving slowly around the apartment. It was a tiny apartment building with maybe only 4 units on the first floor and 4 on the second. There were 2 men inside of that car, and one of them was that strange man. And wouldn't you know it, I recognized the other guy too. It was the same country bumpkin-looking man I'd seen a long time ago. Both men were looking for something, or someone. Then I noticed one of them pointing at my unit, and both of them smiled at each other, as if they knew they had found the right place. I don't believe either of them ever noticed that I was nearby. I quickly ducked out of sight. I can't recall if I ever told my boyfriend that I had seen the strange man near the apartment, but I definitely remember telling him that this creepy guy had been stalking me. He told me not to worry and that I was safe with him, and for about a year I didn't see the strange man, and I really thought that I was safe, that he had given up and moved on. A few months after my boyfriend moved back home, I was still living in the same apartment. The roommate that I previously had moved out so that she could live with her boyfriend, so I was now all alone. On a cold December night during the wee hours of the morning, I woke up because I needed to use the bathroom, and I couldn't hold it any longer. I was sleepy and groggy. I walked into my bathroom, which was inside my bedroom, and I used the toilet. I was wearing these short pajamas which resembled a bodysuit or a kind of onesie for adults. It had several buttons that buttoned up all the way to the neckline. I was too tired to button them all up and wanted to get back to bed immediately, so I took off the bodysuit and crawled back into bed. As I was walking from the toilet back to my bed, I suddenly felt very self-conscious. Despite the fact that there was no one else in the apartment, I felt as if someone was watching me. But I tried to dismiss this thought because it was dark in my apartment, except for the light coming from my bathroom and the light coming from the street lamps outside. I didn't think anyone would be able to see inside. I only had blinds in my windows and there were no curtains, except for one window which was right next to my bed. It wasn't really a curtain, it was a quilt that I'd hung up, to keep the light from the street lamp from keeping me awake. For a time I thought that the blinds provided enough privacy, but now I don't believe they do. It is possible to see through the cracks in the blinds. I don't know why I felt as if someone was watching me then, but I did, and it gave me the creeps. I hadn't seen Strange Guy in over a year, and I hadn't thought about him for a long time. So at the time I wasn't thinking that he could have been standing outside watching me through the windows. I just felt someone was. Truth be told, there may not have been anyone there, but for some reason I felt as if someone was out there. A few weeks later, I think in January, something woke me up in the middle of the night. I heard voices coming from outside. The voices weren't next to my bedroom, but they seemed to be coming from the area outside of my kitchen. At first I thought I was dreaming, but it quickly became apparent that these were real voices coming from 2 different men. I couldn't make out what they were saying. I was hoping it was just some neighbors passing by, but I did catch one thing that they said. One of the men said, "I want to get that bitch." I didn't think that sounded nice, but I didn't think that the person was talking about me. Just a couple of guys standing a little close to my apartment, having a conversation about some woman. But there were several other times when I was sleeping that I'd wake up to a loud scraping noise coming from outside, as if someone were scraping paint. Both times this occurred during the wee hours of the morning, before dawn. I remember thinking to myself that someone must be doing some kind of work outside that involved scraping paint. It never occurred that someone might be scraping away the paint on one of my windows. I did think it was strange that someone would be working that early in the morning before sunrise. I didn't want to believe that there was something more sinister going on. In February, a few days before Valentine's Day, I had a nightmare about someone trying to break in. I don't remember the dream in its entirety. I just remember waking up from it and feeling frightened, but also relieved it was just a dream. I had no way of knowing this dream would prove to be an omen of sorts. A couple of days before Valentine's Day, I was up one night watching TV, getting a few cards ready to mail out to some family members. I finished my task, turned off the television, and went to the bathroom to get ready for bed. I had the door closed. The only light on was in the bathroom. It was then that I heard a noise that sounded as if it were coming from my bedroom window. I opened the bathroom door and saw the silhouette of a man standing right outside my window. I froze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. A man was brazenly trying to break into my apartment while I was still awake. He hadn't even waited for me to turn off the bedroom light, get into bed, and fall asleep. I could see the man's silhouette on my very thin, light-colored quilt as plain as day. He had a knife in his hand, and he had somehow inserted the knife in between the wood and glass, trying to turn the latch on the window so that he could unlock it. If he had succeeded in doing that, then all that he would have to do was raise the window, and he'd be able to come inside. There were no screens or bars on these windows. I was frozen with fear, standing there watching him in disbelief for about a minute. It was clear that he had no intention of giving up. He was extremely determined to open that window. At the time, I didn't know who the man was. The thought that it could have been my stalker never entered my mind once. I ran to my phone and dialed 911. I told the female operator that a man was at my window with a knife, trying to get in. I told her that he was behind my blinds and a quilt that I had hanging up, so I could not see his face. She asked me to pull back the quilt and blinds, just so I could get a description of him, but I refused. I was too terrified to look at him. I didn't want to look into the face of evil. Luckily, the police came in only a matter of minutes. The man at the window must have seen them. He got away from the window, but the police did catch up with him. They spoke to him about what he was doing there. I would find out a short time later, whenever the police came to my door, that the man had told them that he used to have a girlfriend who lived in my apartment building, and that he was looking for her. He told the police that he didn't have a car that night, and that his boss had dropped him off. The police told me that the man appeared to be not only drunk, but perhaps on another kind of substance. They told me that because they hadn't caught him at the window trying to open it, and I had refused the 911 operator's request to pull back the blinds and get a look at him, that they could not arrest him for trying to break in. They did say that they were taking him in for something else, but I don't remember what exactly. I just remember them telling me that they probably wouldn't be able to hold him for too long. As I was talking to the police at my door that night, I glanced over at the police car and saw the man sitting in it. He was watching me. I didn't know him personally, and I didn't know his name, but it was without a doubt the same man that had been in the car with my stalker that day, Old Country Bumpkin. I don't know how I slept that night, but I finally managed to fall asleep. I woke up the next day, went to work, went to my classes, just like any normal day. Only this time I was very alert and very cautious. I walked to my classes like I often did, and as I was walking later that afternoon, I saw a man in a car who looked as if he was trying to get my attention, waving me down. It was old Stalker. A chill went up my spine. I vigorously shook my head no, indicating that I didn't want to speak to him. I took off running in the opposite direction. I glanced back over my shoulder as I was running away and saw him looking at me in his rear view. That would be the last time I saw him. But what was the likelihood of seeing that man the day after Country Bumpkin tried to break into my home? I don't know what my old stalker had in mind, but now that I think about it, maybe he was hoping to persuade me to get into his car, or to meet him somewhere, that he was going to do whatever he could to proceed with his original plan, and to perhaps even kill me. Even though I only saw a single silhouette on my window that night, I believe wholeheartedly that my stalker was in on that attempted break-in, and that he was lurking somewhere nearby, waiting for his accomplice to get the window open so that they both could come inside. He somehow evaded the police. I've never understood why he was so intent on hurting me. At first, I assumed he was angry about my rejection. Maybe he had low self-esteem. Maybe he thought that I thought he wasn't good enough. His obsession with getting revenge seemed to eat away at him for a long time, and it seems as if he had found himself a willing partner in crime, that Country Bumpkin man. I rarely think about my stalker anymore, but sometimes I do. Even though he was never able to physically get to me, I am still terrified when I think about what could have happened. I had a daughter later in life, and she is still a minor. It terrifies me to think about all the creeps who were out there. Trust me when I say that I'll always remind her to not be too trusting and to never let your guard down. R. From SD. It was a nice day out, so I had taken a chair outside from the kitchen. I put its back against the wall and sat down. The weather must have caused me to drift off for a bit. The next thing I knew, I felt someone tapping on my knee. I jolted awake and a sound drew my attention. I looked in that direction just in time to see someone turning the corner. I tried to stand and follow, but a nasty sting stopped me. There was a small cut on my knee that had been touched, where I'd felt the tapping on my knee. I waited for the pain to ease before I tried to catch up with whoever woke me. When I was able to move again, I circled the apartment twice looking for them. I only stopped because I was hungry and wanted to wash my cut. But as I was about to enter the building, I noticed something that put a chill up my spine. Sticking out of the door, stabbed into it, was an old-fashioned razor blade with a hint of blood on it. What made the discovery chilling was that the door was ajar. My natural reaction was to call the police, so they sent a patrol car, and I wasn't left waiting too long. The 2 police officers searched around but found nothing. I tried to put this whole weird thing behind me. A week later, another day with beautiful weather, I decided to walk around town. The streets were mostly empty because of isolation. The abandoned look is pleasantly spooky. As I pass by a building, I hear a voice from its open doorway. Soft and slightly lisping, I hear, "I remember you." I turned toward the speaker. A plump, balding man stood before me, dressed like a mechanic. A sewn-on name tag identified him as R. I couldn't place him. "Have we met before? Sorry, but I don't recognize you." I told him truthfully. He smiled. "How is your sister?" he asked, using her name. He looked too old to be her friend. I assumed him to be a teacher then. I told him she was currently living with family. He nodded. "Still got that pet hamster?" I paused when I heard that question. Was he still talking about my sister? I answered no. The longer the conversation went, the stranger it got. He asked about my family members long dead, friends that I've lost track of, teachers that have retired. I didn't know a thing about him, but he knew almost everything about me. "I'm sorry to hold you up from your journey," he said, patting my shoulder. "When you reach your mom, tell her I said hi." I'm not sure how he knew my destination. I certainly didn't tell him. As I walked away, I felt as if he was right behind me, following right on my heels. I glanced behind me, but did not see him. When I made it to my mom, I told her about the strange encounter with R and asked her if anyone fit his description. She didn't answer immediately. She was just staring at me. "Mom, what's wrong?" I asked. "How did you cut your shoulder?" she asked me. Confused, I put my hand on one of my shoulders and then the other. One of them stung when I touched it. The same shoulder R had pat. So far, I have not seen R again, and I'm not sure if I ever will. One thing I do know is if I do see him again, I'm not letting him get close enough to touch me. Magazines from JDW. This happened back during my years of grade school, if I remember correctly. My sister and I are in college now, but this still gives me the creeps and rubs me the wrong way. Our parents left us home alone one night to go get dinner. They gave us our usual instructions before leaving. Lock the doors, lock the windows, don't stay up too late, and if there's an emergency, The numbers and information we need are in the little phone book above the counter. And most importantly, if someone comes to the door, do not answer it." With that, they were off. Coming and going at odd hours, like late at night, wasn't unusual, especially for our dad. He had a job that sometimes had him working late into the night, and we lived in a very safe cul-de-sac, so being left alone was not an issue. That night, however, our parents were out later than usual. At the time, we didn't give it much thought. Using kid logic, the longer we were alone, the more time we got to play on the computer or watch TV. So why worry about it? I'm not sure what made us leave our rooms, abandoning our precious cartoons and games just to loiter in the kitchen. It's not like we were hungry, and we didn't have any pets to feed or take out. We started to talk to each other, finally acknowledging the time and just how long we had been alone, and while we weren't afraid, we were getting antsy and wondering when our parents would come back. Let me just mention here that this was a time before smartphones. Cell phones were a thing, but they weren't super common. If you had to call someone, you only had their landline. That meant no calling our parents. We weren't talking for long when something got my sister's attention, and before I could ask her anything, she motioned me over and we began to listen. There were footsteps coming from our front porch, but there was something off. Even over our talking, we should have heard someone ascend the stairs. The flight of stairs is long and they're old and creaky, and no amount of stealth can let you walk quietly on them. What's more is they only started at the very last row of stairs, almost as if the owner appeared out of nowhere. As we continued to listen and quietly talk to each other, we remembered at that last set of stairs there was a double railing. Think like the railing of an escalator but taller. I'm not sure the purpose of their design, but if you can get over them, then you can easily skip most of the stairs, and while it takes some effort, an adult can scale them, just like climbing over a fence. Any more questions we had were cut off when there was a sudden knock at the door. We expected to hear a neighbor or something, but no one spoke. There was a second knock a moment later, but still no one spoke. There was a long pause. Then we heard the handle to the storm door turn and the door slide open. In that moment, we scrambled away from the door and backed into the kitchen. We had forgotten to lock the screen door after our parents had told us to lock everything down. Without thinking, I quietly asked my sister if we had managed to lock up everything else. A loud rattle cut off her reply. Looking back at the door, whoever was out there was trying to open the interior door. The doorknob twisted one way, then another, and repeated, becoming more hasty with each turn. We snatched up the phone book from its cubby and the phone from its cradle, frantically flipping through the pages, trying to find someone we knew. It didn't occur to us at the time to call the police, and we really only knew 2 of our neighbors. By then, the door itself was shaking, handle still trying to turn as if whomever was outside was trying to force it open. Unfortunately, I can't really remember much of the conversations we had, but I remember that we called one of our grandparents, explaining to them what was happening. They did their best to help, but they were cities away. I can't quite remember the conversation, but I think that they told us to call our neighbors, which we did. We repeated the same panicked message to our neighbors. I remember when talking to the neighbors that the noise stopped. I remember the neighbor calming us down, saying not to worry, it's just people selling magazines, that they had gone to their house too. I remember my parents finally coming home, and we relayed the night events to them, but not much more. I remember asking our mom about the incident. I think she agreed that someone was trying to sell magazines or something, even though it was so late. We never really got a clear explanation, never heard or saw anyone. I don't think I'll ever find out who was really at our door that night, and it scares me. What I can say for sure is that no one tries to bust in your door because they want to sell you some magazines. Park Stalker, from Jessie L. This happened about 2 years ago, and still scares me when I think about it. I live in the UK, and I'm from a smallish area, nothing fancy. I'm 18, but at the time I was 16, working at a family friend's pub collecting glasses. I'd work from 7 to 11 at night, and I lived about half an hour to 45 minutes away. To get home, I would have to walk through a park. This park has 3 entrances and exits, 2 at the top and 1 at the bottom, which leads into the town center and main shopping area. The top 2 lead to 2 different areas, one being a skate park and the other is literally right next to a comprehensive school and a big field. This park had a lot of bushes and trees in it and only has a few lights. These lights shut off at around 10:30. Only lights left after that are the lampposts, which sat outside of each entrance to the park, but they're very dim. Each entrance has a big gate and they're always open. I would have to walk the path that led towards the school since it was the fastest way home. I worked at the pub for a year, sticking to the same routine to get home. I would leave at around 11. It would take about 10 minutes to get to the park, so I'd be walking through the park at around 11:30. Now, the one entrance I had to use to get into the park was the one at the bottom, the one that leads to the shopping area. It had 1 lamppost outside the gate and that was it. With it, I could only see about 10 feet into the park. There were a few benches and no one was ever in the park at that time. During autumn and winter, it was always empty, even the streets were, so you could imagine my shock when I saw a man sitting on one of the benches. Now, this was strange. It's around 45 minutes past 11, almost 12 at night. It's pitch black out and freezing and the dude was just sitting there on the bench. I couldn't see him too well at first, but as I got closer, I got a good look at him. He was young, about 20 to 25. He had long hair in a ponytail, but not a scruffy one. It was tight and neat. He had a hoop earring and his nose was pierced. I can't remember the color of his eyes, but he was very pale, and his hair was jet black with red tips, which went past his shoulders. He wore all black and dressed like an emo, to be honest. Looking back on it now, he reminded me of Dracula from the movie Van Helsing. He was on his phone and looked up at me as I walked past him. He stared at me. I gave him a slight nod and smile and just kept walking. He looked me up and down and smirked, which kind of freaked me out. He didn't say anything and I managed to get home. I didn't think much of him and forgot about it. The following night I went to work, I finished my shift and walked through the park again. And once more he was there, on his phone, wearing that all black hair and a ponytail. He looked up and saw me again, smiling, and I smiled back, but I walked faster this time. Just like before, he didn't say anything. On the 3rd night, this repeated, but on the 4th night, he wasn't there. So I walked through the park as usual, but the entire time I felt extremely uneasy. It was dark, no light except for the moon. And what did I suddenly hear? Footsteps, quick ones behind me. So I turned around and I didn't see anything. But I wasn't taking any chances. I ran through the park, and I swear over the sound of my heartbeat and my rapid footsteps, I could hear twigs snapping and leaves crunching. After that, I began getting a lift home for about 2 weeks from a friend. But that friend soon went on holiday, so I had to start walking home through the park again. The first night, which was Monday, the man wasn't there, but I still felt uncomfortable. It was like I was being watched. The second night, he was there, sitting on the bench like he used to, smiling and looking at me, but this time he did speak to me, in a very deep voice. "Hey. Love the tights and skirt." I was wearing a black skirt and sheer tights with thick black thigh-high socks and Doc Martens with a black biker jacket and thick scarf. I had to wear all black for work. I looked at him awkwardly and smiled and hurried away. The next few weeks he would be in the park and he would make the same kind of gross comments, always sitting on that bench. I would try to get lifts home as often as I could, but I'd still have to walk through the park most of the time. Oh, I hated it. One night things escalated. I walked through the park as usual, and again he was there sitting and smiling at me. I tried to ignore him this time, as he made comments about my body and what he wanted to do to me. As I was walking away, I was out of the light, so I could only see 2 or 3 feet in front of me. I must have been about 20 feet away then when I heard running behind me. I turned around, and bam, Someone runs right into me full speed, knocking me to the ground. There was a heavy weight on me, and instantly I could feel hair on my face and a hand over my mouth. It was the guy. He was attacking me, and he seemed ravenous. The moment he took his hand off my mouth, I took the chance to bite him as hard as I could. He screamed and set up off me. I could barely see, but he was holding his hand and cursing at me, so I took the chance and pushed him off me and got up. I started to run, and I heard him running after me. I ran towards the first gate, the one I usually use to leave, but I was shocked, horrified, to see it was locked. I could see it had a lock on it because of the lamppost on the other side. I was so confused, but I could hear him shouting, and I started to run again. I ran towards the other gate, and it was closed, but not all the way. There was a small gap, so I squeezed through. This was the skate park gate. I managed to get through as he tried to grab me, and I turned and looked at him for a few seconds, catching my breath. He stared at me, and then started to try to fit through the gate, so I booked it as fast as I could. I ran toward the skate park path. The skate park was full of bushes. I ran to them and hid inside the bushes, waiting for him. I sat there hiding, with my hand over my mouth. I sat for a minute when I saw him running through the skate park looking for me. He slowed down near the exit path, which leads to a long path, and he literally stood there for a minute, sniffing the air like a psycho. No joke, he was sniffing it like some sort of dog. His hair wasn't in a ponytail anymore. It was all over. He was wearing a long-sleeved black shirt. It was winter, which confused me since it was so darned cold. He looked around, and I felt his eyes scanning for me. He kept on looking, beginning to walk down the long path. After about 10 minutes, I felt it was safe, and I ran back toward the park. I made it back to the locked gate. This time I climbed over it. I walked toward the school, following the path I always used, and had a strange urge to look back, and there, at the gate, was the man. He was standing and watching me. He laughed, saying, "I'll catch you one day. Mark my words." And then that freak blew me a kiss. I walked away into the dark. I'd never been so scared in all my life. I booked it home, telling my mom what happened. We reported it to the police and council and asked why the fence was locked. The council was just as confused. They had never locked the gate before. The police couldn't do much. They put a warning out, and that was about it. The creepy thing was, he had to have learned my pattern. He had to have known I used the park every night to get home. It creeps me out to this day knowing I was being watched, and something far worse could have happened to me if I didn't fight back, or if I hadn't fought back successfully. I still have nightmares from time to time about him, and wonder what would have happened to me if I hadn't gotten away, or if he had found me in those bushes. I quit working at that pub, and I haven't went to that park since. To that creepy guy at the park, let's not meet again. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails, but I hope you enjoyed the stories. If you have a story, send it over to us at darkstories.org. I'd love to narrate it. We're looking for European monster sightings and stories from abandoned places. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to like and share it with someone. It really helps us out. Until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who have donated or continue to donate. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.